Michael Sainsbury. We're the gritty and real alternative, Mr. Sainsbury. Michael Sainsbury, our next speaker, is the former China correspondent for The Australian. A career journalist now based in Bangkok, Michael contributes for Crikey and is published widely across Asia on business and politics. At Together's first conference, an audience member likened Michael to George Clooney. His loved ones are still recovering. Today, Michael will talk about Australia and its place in the world, particularly Southeast Asia, and he may touch on home affairs. Please welcome Michael Sainsbury.
Those lights are awful. Apparently Amala and I have split up, so I'm available. Probably the best way to go is to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a journalist, and I got lucky enough to get the job as the China correspondent for The Australian. Lucky for two reasons. One was that it got me out of the head office in Australia as my newspaper was careering very quickly towards the cliff of the right wing, and I was basically allowed to do my own thing and write about some stuff that was really interesting without too much interference, because they really weren't that interested in what was going on in China unless it had big numbers and it was about iron ore. So you go to China as a China correspondent, you suddenly find yourself as the kind of the mining writer. It was during the time of the Rio Tinto stuff, and Stern, who was thrown into jail. But reflecting back on that, it was a fantastic gig. And when they asked me to come back, I said, to do what? They said, have a think about what you want to do. And I've seen so many foreign correspondents come back to the newspaper and sort of end up in crappy jobs, or just sort of end up leaving eventually because all the good jobs are taken by people, especially in this era where media budgets are shrinking, so everyone's hanging on to their jobs. And I said, to write about what, really? Business, politics, goes round and round and round and round. What I was interested in is finding out a little bit about the bit between China and Australia, which is Southeast Asia, which most Australians think about as beach holiday, and they don't really think they're leaving Australia much. They go to Bali, they go to Phuket. And so, I've been engaged in learning about visiting places like Myanmar, the Philippines, Cambodia, East Timor, other parts of Indonesia. It's been really quite fascinating. But trying to get people in Australia to run stories about this has become harder and harder and harder. And I think this is obviously been annoying for me. So I end up working for the Japanese and working for the Americans and people who want to read about the places that are our neighbours. But increasingly Australian publications are interested in stories about our neighbours, and we as a country, I think, are not as interested about our neighbours, certainly not at a government level. Government's not leading us in the way that governments in the past have. Governments, Gough Whitlam opened China up to Australia. Malcolm Fraser, to his credit, welcomed the Vietnamese refugees in when the Labor Party didn't want to. Bob Hawke recognised the trade opportunities with China, and Paul Keating saw the bigger picture of places like Indonesia and how important all those big countries, very big countries, on our doorstep are to Australia, but we don't really know much about them at all, and we are not engaged with them particularly well. At the moment, as we sit here, one of the most important political meetings, annual meetings in the world is happening in Beijing, the annual rubber stamp National People's Congress in China, where 3,000 top cadres meet, tell us what their economic policies are, tell us what their defence policies are, tell us which policies they're going to use this year to attack religion or attack the Muslims in Xinjiang. They lay it all out for us. Does anyone read about it? Does anyone know about it? Not particularly. There's an election going on, a big election campaign going on in Indonesia, which is kind of pretty important to Australia. Are we reading about it? Do we know much about it? Is the government talking about it? No, they're not. There's an election in May in the biggest democracy in the world, India, which is very shortly going to be a top 5 economy in the world. Do we know about it? Are we reading about it? Do we understand that there's a government there that's persecuting not just the Muslims there, the 200 million Muslims, they're persecuting Christians, they're persecuting all sorts of people in the name of politics. We don't understand any of this stuff. We are a country that is increasingly looking inwards, and I think that's pretty obvious by having had a look at our politicians over the last recent past. Kevin Rudd at least gave it a bit of a go. But since then, we've had Tony Abbott and Julia Gillard, who wasn't much chop at that stuff anyway. And then poor old Malcolm, who was too busy trying to save his job for 3 years, and he couldn't even do that properly. So I think I think what Anne said really rang a bell with me. It's government's role to lead, and it's government's role to tell us, government should be saying to Australia, like the way, and look, I know we're probably all quite fond of Paul Keating. He had the right idea that we should be, looking at all of our neighbours and learning about them. We let so many migrants into this country. We have so many interesting people here. We're one of the great migrant countries of the world, but we don't know anything really about the cultures and about the people that live here, that have come from those places. We want them to become more like us, and we, apparently, us, are European, but we're not anymore. So there's sort of a national identity crisis that's sort of playing out a bit in our foreign policy, or lack of foreign policy, which focuses increasingly on 2 things, defence and trade. And it is completely schizophrenic. We have our defence buddy is America, and the Americans aren't kind of doing much at all at the moment. I mean, no one knows what Trump's up to. But the Americans are not focused on Asia as much as Barack Obama tried to have a pivot over here. The Chinese are very focused on Asia, and which is fine. But we need to engage and understand that we need to find a way to have our own foreign policy that, we've got a trading partner in China that's 30% of our trade, 80% of our trade is with Asia. The only 2 trading partners we've got in the top 10 that aren't Asian, the US and New Zealand, which is kind of a bit like us, but actually doing a bit of a better job than us. So we're having, there's a real problem in government of being able to carve out Australian identity and Australian foreign policy that, obviously trade's important, defence is important, but also understanding our neighbours is important. And that's become even more difficult through the creation of, and Mark Setter might touch on this, of this mega Department of Home Affairs, which has created, and Anne would probably understand that, sorry, my mouth's a bit dry. Do you want to get some water? Yeah. Wine, water, beer, anything. The creation of this mega Department of Home Affairs has taken away the Australian Federal Police and the Australia's internal spy agency, ASIO, out of the Attorney General's Department. So it's basically ripped the guts out of that. It's created a new border force called the Australian Border Force, and we've all seen them in action at the airport. There was a story around this week that the defence forces are having to fill in the gaps because the Australian Border Force is not doing its job properly. So you've got this Home Affairs Department that's become so powerful that the Department of Foreign Affairs has actually been pushed right down the ladder in Canberra and has no real sway at sort of cabinet level anymore. So we've now got defence, we've got foreign affairs, and now we've got home affairs. So and everyone understands how bureaucracies work. So we've now got infighting amongst 3 big departments about who's running Australia's foreign affairs. And you look at our Prime Minister, I don't think anyone is. Thank you.